Good morning, everybody. A warm welcome. My name is Michiel Koolman. I'm the chair of Workplace Pride. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special symposium. Workplace Pride is an organization that fights for LGBTIQ plus workplace inclusion. We do that in many different ways. One way is that we have different communities. One community is academia at Workplace Pride, which is a co-organizer. But of course, a very important way is through our chair. Our chair is Janneke van der Toorn, stands here, has been working with us for, this is our 6th year, super successful. We just had a quick evaluation. Great to do research in this area, but also to really tap into the synergies between research and what really helps on the work floor. So discussions between academics, D&I officials and HR officials, which is very much on the agenda today. It's also a co-production with the Sustainable Cooperation Program. Very good. So a great program today. And the topic itself, the ERGs, are very close to my heart. My day job is with Elsevier, where I started Elsevier Pride 10 years ago. And I really feel that the ERGs are catalysts for change in the workplace. So I'm very much looking forward to this program. And I give the floor back to you, Janneke.
Thank you. Thank you, Michiel. It's very nice to have you all here. Yes? I am on mute, I think. No, I should be. In Teams, I should be on mute, and in the live stream, they should be hearing. Okay, maybe check downstairs if they can turn on the live stream. Yes, so that is what we're doing here, right? We're trying to work this in a hybrid way by having both online and on-site. So I'm really happy that so many of you decided to come on-site and join us. We have a really nice program for you. Now everything is stopping. Just a few tips and tricks to navigating this symposium. If you do not wish to be in the live stream, where they cannot hear us at the moment apparently, then do not sit in the front row. So that's one thing. There is also a photographer here. He's going to take pictures, but he tries to avoid the audience. If you're worried about being in the picture, just talk to him. He's right there with the camera in the back, and we can make sure that any photos that have you in it are deleted. So that's a second tip. If you have a question after the talks, then please just raise your hand here. Online, we have in Teams interaction opportunity. We're moderating it, or at least viewing any questions that turn up there, but we are prioritizing the on-site symposium, so just for your information. Please use respectful, inclusive language at all times, and please do share how much you are inspired by this symposium on Insta or on Twitter if you like, and then mention Leiden and mention Workplace Pride. The meat of our program. Paula, is it working better on the live stream? Okay, great. I'm very happy about that. And just for those viewing the live stream, the Teams also shows the slides, just in case you cannot see it in the right-hand corner. They have a bit of a delay, so that's just how it is. We will be talking faster than what you will be seeing on the slide screen. But I would like to introduce our main speaker today, Anna Enesdotter, who's a professor at York University, a senior lecturer in work management and organizing, and an expert in discriminatory practices at work and the promotion of inclusive workplaces. She's a very active scholar in this field, and not just in terms of research, but also in terms of collaborating with stakeholders in private, public, and third sectors. So I'm really, really happy that she is here. She really is the person that knows most, I think, in management on LGBTIQ plus ERGs. That's why we invited her. And will tell us today about the provoking issue of whether LGBTIQ plus ERGs have been derailed. Anna, without further ado.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to do the eye test to see which one works better, these glasses or these? That with these. I think that's better, yeah. Okay, I'm really pleased to be here with you this morning, and so I'm Anna Einarsdóttir. I identify as lesbian, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm also a reader in management at the University of York. So what I'd like to share with you is some of the work I've done with my team over the last few years, and that concerns ERG groups, which we actually refer to employee networks. So do apologize that I will be using a language that is familiar to myself. All right, but we're talking about the same thing here. So it's important to note from the start that the research was undertaken before COVID hit us. So everything has to be seen in that light. It was before we were actually doing these live stream. It was before we had any kind of hybrid notions. So yes, we were prioritizing very much about meeting face to face at that point. So let's see a little bit about where we started off with. So at the time when we started the research, we didn't really know a great deal about what the networks are like, who is involved, what they do and what they don't do. So we actually came from almost like a blank place. But this is generally what networks were perceived to do. So firstly, they were considered to give networks people a voice. Then it was considered networks were really important to increase visibility of LGBT plus people and matters. And then there's a third element, which was about building community. And I suppose in my talk, I'm going to be referring back to these three principles, really, because these were the three key pillars that we were really trying to understand when we started off. So this is the research that we undertook. This is our webpage where you can actually find all the information that you possibly need about the project itself. So as you can see there from the slide, this project concerned the NHS, which is the National Health Service in the UK. And the reason why we collaborated with the National Health Service was simply because they are a large enough organization that would have multiple networks operating that we could sort of tap into in terms of research purposes. Now, the research was done, as I say, with NHS. We partnered up with NHS employers, which is like a support mechanism for staff working in the NHS. We also worked with Stonewall, which is, I don't know whether it's equivalent to Workplace Pride, maybe? Don't know, yeah. A national organization for LGBT plus identifying people in the UK. And then we worked with a consultancy company that focuses on supporting employee networks in general. So there was a lot of sort of collaboration from the very get-go. So let me just go briefly over, without spending too much time on it, what we did actually do in the research. Yep. This is how it looks like in broad terms. So we surveyed over 4,000 people working in the NHS about lots of different things, including network involvement, their workplace experience, and just a lot of different factors. Now, this survey was inclusive of all genders and all sexualities. And we have, of those over 4,000 responses, we have 516 responses that identify as LGBT+. We then had a second set of survey, which was focused on the organizations themselves. So we only needed one response from them. So that sort of captured the context and where the networks are operating, which is quite important because they are really different. They're different organizations. So that's the quantitative side of things. And then we did a lot of work with the networks themselves. So we worked with nine different networks that operate in the NHS in different organizations, different trusts, there's service organizations, there's different acute trusts, there's mental health trusts, community services, lots of different kind of organizations that were involved. So what we did with those 9 case studies, if you like, was that we spent an awful lot of time with them. We attended their activities, we took part in meetings, we were part of conferences like this that they put on, and so on. So we have actually a pretty good idea about what networks do and what happens within networks, because we were there. And then we interviewed a lot of people, both those who were members, we interviewed allies, we interviewed EDI and HR professionals that were involved. So these interviews came to 66 in the end. And then as a side project, so sort of towards the end, we did some video recordings. We put the best way to describe it is really, if you can imagine a passport photo booth. You've all done that. You pressed it, taken some pictures, and off you go. In this case, we put a booth like that in organizations and offered people to come to record themselves on video, on camera, for 30 seconds. So we had about 120 recordings of people who wanted to say something about their experience as LGBT plus identifying or as being part of a network. So there's a lot that goes into this. And obviously, what I'm going to share with you today is only a fraction of what we've done. But just to give you a snapshot of what we have found so far, it's a work in progress. So starting with identities and the issues of absence and silence, it was clear to us, having spent a lot of time with the networks, that meetings were really central to what networks do. So they all, more or less, 8 out of the 9 networks, they had meetings regularly. But we were really, really taken back by the lack of discussion about identities at meetings. We really couldn't really work it out why that was the case. So, for example, if people were introducing themselves, they would say, "Hello, I'm Anna. I'm a reader in management." So they were focused entirely on their professional identities, and instead of introduce them by their sexual orientation or gender identity, or both. So for us as researchers, this was really, really surprising, and also made our life really, really difficult, because we couldn't really work out who was a member of the network and who was an ally. And that was also an issue that the network were grappling with themselves. So there seemed to be this kind of culture of don't ask, don't know. And the members were totally unaware of who was represented in the network and who was not. So what we did in the survey, we just asked, who is in the network? And this is what we found. I skipped one here. I'm gonna go back on what I said. So this is just an example of what people said when we talked about representation. So this is very typical of when we ask people about, so who's represented in the group? And these were the typical kind of responses that we got. So here's one person saying, I think there's a good representation. And we have another one that says, oh, we did have somebody who identified as bisexual, but he's left. He's left the trust. And then there's another one here that says, there's no trans in this group. I don't think there's a trans in the organization. And these were the kind of conversation that we had on an individual basis with people during the interview. So on that basis, we were really intrigued to, going back to my previous point about who's in the network, and this is actually the slide I was going to show you. So we asked, who's involved in the network? And this is really what we see. So the green bar indicates cisgender individuals. The pink bar is transgender. So as you can immediately see there that actually networks are really not diverse at all, are they? They are, they are dominated by gay men, cisgender men, shall I say. There's quite a lot of lesbians involved, and a surprisingly high number of allies as well. And then we have bisexuals. There's not a lot of them in the networks. And people who identify outside of these categories, there's a significant part of people there, but not much. And there's also people who are not really sure about how they define themselves. So, the umbrella network that LGBT plus are meant to be represented isn't like that in reality. So, the next point I want to make here is to go back on the actual analysis of the diversity. So in summary, they simply are not diverse and they lack inclusion. So the networks are dominated by gay men, as we saw, to a lesser extent lesbians. They're usually white, and they're also people in managerial positions. That means that there are people who can manage their own diaries. They can nip out and go to a meeting. Whereas people working on the ward, for example, patient-facing, they just really struggled. They just weren't there. So the meetings were not really representative at all. Now, you would think that when the networks is not so diverse, that people will be running for the hills and trying to reach out to people that are not there. But again, remember, they don't know who's there. So they don't know who they should be reaching out to because they don't ask, they don't tell. So this culture of silence is really causing an issue that people don't know who's there, who is dominating the meeting and who is not represented. So there were only 14% of the networks that had any form of outreach program when they probably all needed them. So marketing networks as an LGBT plus obscured the reality of membership really, because it wasn't really the case. It's more like L and G, maybe, an ally, possibly. And then people who identify any other than gay or lesbian were, as we frame it, othered in the discourses at the meetings with conversations such as these. And I'm going to show you an example of a couple of examples what took place, conversation that took place at meetings. So, here's one. Obviously, we're keen to make sure that sort of the queer, non-binary sort of border sexual identities are properly represented so we're not too old. Second example here. It gets really confusing, doesn't it? You know, when you heard of gender fluid, binary, non-binary, pansexual, and the list goes on. And people really did struggle. So the networks that actually should be really inclusive and really welcoming to people, there were actually examples of a lot of othering techniques that were happening at meetings that possibly pushed some people away. Okay. So, moving to an entirely different thing. But we also want to know something about, remember, the visibility. The visibility is really strong, and there's something that the network should be doing, so increasing visibility of LGBT members. So we asked in the survey if people were aware of networks in their trust. And of no surprise, LGBT identified people, you see there on the right-hand side on the screen, they were obviously more aware of staff networks, but there was a considerable number of people who actually didn't know. As for cisgender heterosexual people, they were less aware of staff networks, and that means any staff networks. We're talking about any staff networks. But there's still sort of awareness about them, so they're not unknown to people. And clearly, if you're in a minority group, you're more aware. They speak to you in some ways, and obviously you pick it up more. But those who are from the dominant group are less aware, because there's something that doesn't speak to them in the same way. We then wanted to ask whether the network actually helped to increase the visibility of LGBT plus people. And we were quite taken back by this, because we were kind of expecting that LGBT identifying people would be, yes, it's increasing the visibility. But actually, it's the heterosexual cisgender people who believe that the networks make matters more visible for LGBT people. We weren't expecting that. So there's something that the networks do also for allies, not just for the LGBT communities, but equally for allies. I want to say a few words about the operation of networks. Having spent a lot of time with them, I do feel I have some understanding of what they do. I don't know everything, of course, and there's a lot of things that we're still kind of uncovering. But one thing that struck us from the get-go was that actually meetings are central to networks operation, and they were completely and utterly dominated by the gender. So what you see there, the picture there on the right-hand side, is an example of an agenda that we've anonymized, but gives you a flavor of what it is that people actually cover at meetings. So there was a lot to go through for the networks. There were issues to resolve. They were very, very procedural, weren't they? And there were a few points that I wanted to kind of raise with you specifically. And these were that they focused a lot on operational things. There was minutes to take, there was items to cover, there was an update log, and there was planning of events, and that really took up a great deal of people's time. So that meant, of course, there was hardly any time for personal sharing at all. That wasn't even on the agenda. That was nowhere to be found. And that meant simply that the important discussions that could take place were pushed at the end of the meeting under any other business. And that was the time where the most interesting conversation actually took place, because people were bringing up issues that were faced within organizations, and sometimes, if they were just left, they were not picked up again at the following meeting. We know, we were there. So it felt like quite a missed opportunity by operationalizing the networks in such a strong way. So there was very limited space for personal sharing. And the focus was very much on organizational objectives, aims and objectives. What we also noticed that the presence of allies could have an inhibiting effect. It seems like it could silence people at the meeting. So when allies outnumber LGBT identifying, and that happened in a lot of networks, so actually LGBT identifying people were in minority. We just felt a bit skewed. So it became really, really problematic, and as I said before, don't ask, don't tell, so people didn't know. And we think it would have been so uncomfortable for everybody in the room, for the allies to realize that they were actually outnumber LGBT plus people, and equally for LGBT plus identified people to realize that they were in a small minority. So it kind of worked together to silence and suppress the identities there. So then, of course, the meetings were very much dominated by the discourses in the NHS, the issues that the NHS was facing, and the whole culture of the NHS obviously had a big effect. So I want to say a few things about impact. That was an interesting point, actually, about impact. And we were really keen to be able to say something. And we were hoping that we could say something really, really concrete about impact. But the issue was that the networks faced great pressure to evidence impact. That was partly to get more funding. And there was a huge, because of the pressure, they would put on events that weren't necessarily connected to the local issues that people were facing. It was rather more generic in nature, so it just felt like not as targeted as it could have been. So many networks didn't have any information about what are the local issues that people are facing here, because they simply didn't have access to that information. Or they didn't know how to work through the survey material to make sense of it. Remember, people were doing this on top of their normal jobs. This is voluntary, so they were only trying to do their best. So because of the pressure to evidence impact, many relied on quite quick and easy fixes to that. So they used a lot of freebies, they used a lot of rainbow badges, lanyards and so forth, to really raise awareness and signal understanding of LGBT plus matters, or showcase organizational inclusivity, which was really important. But these were really difficult to measure, the outcome with, except they could count how many lanyards they had actually distributed, how many badges they had brushed out, and so forth. And finally, the involvement of allies was linked to generate impact, because they also meant that the network was growing. That meant that we had more impact in some ways. I want to say a few things about community. That was the third aspect of the first slide that I presented at the beginning. So we asked quite specific questions in the survey. And we wanted to understand if people felt like they were a part of a family in this organization. So were they a part of something bigger? Okay, and our results show that over half of people involved in LGBT plus networks agree with the statement, but there's a difference between heterosexual cisgender individuals and LGBT identifying. Because heterosexual cisgender respondents feel more part of the family than actually LGBT plus, which is interesting. So there's something that the networks also give the allies, not just the LGBT community. So on the other end, just under 40% of LGBT respondents who were not involved in any staff works agreed to this statement. So there's clearly that there is something about the network that gives people a sense of belonging, a sense of being part of something bigger. Now, we were also interested in this. Similar theme, building community. We want to know whether people have at least one friend they work with. And again, similar type of results, that almost 2/3 of respondents who are involved in an LGBT network agree with the statements. And there's no difference between heterosexual cisgender respondents and LGBT plus. But for those who are not involved in networks, they are less likely to agree with this statement. So there seems to be something that a community sense is beginning to emerge, but it plays out differently for LGBT plus than allies, perhaps. Okay. We also want to know, so does it really matter if you're in a network? Does that give you any kind of protection, if you like, against negative behavior? And it does. It does seem to do that, because 4 out of 5 LGBT plus network members agree that staff networks make matters better for employees with protected characteristics. And protected characteristics is by law issues like race, gender, ethnicity, religious or religion, and there's but 9 different factors, disability. And if we compare to, this is compared to, so 78% of sexual gender minority members actually thought the same. Interestingly again, 93% of heterosexual cisgender members did agree to this statement. So they actually think that there's more protection to be gained. They don't quite know what to make of this yet. And then 71% of people who are involved in other types of networks, so BAME networks, disability networks, women's network, felt the same, that it offered protection. Okay, and then wanted to say a few words about sort of start to think differently about networks, okay? I think the questions on the left-hand side are questions that we typically ask of networks. For example, why do people join networks? And I would like us to focus on other things, like what do they leave? What is in it for them? How do they gain from it? And a lot of that we focus on growing membership. How do we grow membership? Because the emphasis is really much on numbers. So I'd like to ask, so do numbers really matter? Or is it about the core group? Is it about the key people there? Is it important that it's big? Or is it just the people that really matter? So then, how diverse are networks? I would like to ask, is everybody welcome? I put a big question mark to that, considering what we see in the networks and what we found. What structure work best? There's different structures. And then you need to ask for who? Who does it need to work for? And then we are really occupied about what is the purpose of networks, and perhaps we need to be focusing on what are the issues that people face in your organization. And then finally, what do networks do? And then we maybe should ask, so who benefits from the network activities? Maybe not just the LGBT community, maybe somebody else. Or nobody. Like to finish on this kind of key messages. There's a whole host of other things that I could have said, but you have to narrow it somehow. So as we've seen, networks lack diversity, and they do not represent the communities they're meant to serve. Involving allies can be a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it was seen like generally a positive force, but when when allies outnumber LGBT identified members, that is an issue, and people haven't really thought this through. It's not good enough to say, oh, everybody's welcome. You really need to think about the consequences of that, and I don't think we have reached that point yet. The purpose of network isn't clear. We asked that in all the interviews. It was really woolly. People don't know why they're there, what they're doing, what they want to achieve. Problem. And then also the focus has shifted from supporting LGBT plus employees to championing an organizational agenda on equality, diversity, and inclusion. Before I kind of finish, I'd like to just draw attention to the whole host of resources that we have on the website. There's all the reports that you want, they're there, including publications as well that is already in press. And then you can find the videos that I was talking about. You can find 50 of them, you can have a look, see for yourself. And then finally, I just want to, if we have time. Okay, it's only 30 seconds. I want to share with you the film that we produced out of the, to present our research findings. You can access this film also via the website. This is only a trailer, and it shows, the reason why we did it was that we wanted to show people what was going on in meetings and kind of help us to raise issues. It's difficult to explain them, you have to see them. And we want to capture things like awkwardness and boredom and what people do at meetings. So this is the trailer, so you can see the film in its entirety if you like. I'll finish on that.
Oh, welcome, Vanya, says Dev. Don't worry, most of us don't bite. Yes, welcome, Vanya. Actually, Vanya, how did you hear about us? Was it an email or... Oh, I was told... She hands Stuart a flyer. Oh, I think you're in the wrong meeting. You want the LGBTQI plus positive mental health group. You've ended up with us by mistake. She picks up her bag, smiles apologetically, and walks to the door.
So that's it. Thank you so much.
There is time for one or two questions, and Hal has the mic, so if anybody has a question, she will find you. Any hands? Yeah, Christine? I can repeat it.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the It's working now. Thank you very much. Maybe I missed it in the beginning, but what was the representation of the group that you did research on in the NHS? Was that all the layers of the organization?
Yes, pretty much. There was different kinds of trusts. There was acute trust, there was mental health trust, there were ambulance services, there were service organizations. So they were across, they represented in some ways different organizations. And we haven't really looked into it very carefully about what it means in terms of the different organizational context, but that's still to be done in some ways. Okay. But there are some definite parallels.
Okay, thank you.
There was also a question in the back at the left.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. I have one question. So I was wondering whether there is any heterogeneity in the responses, because you merge them all into gender minorities, right? And then compare them to heterosexual people. So I was wondering whether you found some differences in, for instance, gay males, lesbian females, etc. Or was the sample size too low? So I'm just wondering.
We could do some sort of split analysis in the groups because the experience aren't the same. These are different, people have completely different experiences. And we tried our best, we're still doing the analysis and sort of teasing out so what's what and how people live and experience things differently. But for some questions, the sample size is so small, it's really difficult to make any kind of meaningful reference from that end. But yeah, really important, still ongoing work to do.
Thank you.
Al, right before, in front.
Hi, do you have like a total number of respondents that actually responded to this research? And out of the respondents, total respondents, how many were they gay? You put in percentage, but is there a number to the number of people? Because sometimes percentage can be deceiving. It can be 1 and then it's still 10%, but it can be 30 and then 10% as well. So is there a number represented? And then in one of your slides, you put trust A and trust F. What does that represent? I just need a clarification. Thanks.
Yeah. So on the numbers, so the total responses that we received from LGBT plus identifying people were 516 out of 4,237, if I remember correctly. So yes, the number were sometimes very low, and in some groups lower than others. For example, we didn't know that how many trans responses we would get, but we have about 30. So yes, it's large enough group for us to say something about it, but obviously will have an impact on the total analysis. As for the trust A, B, and C, that's simply for our reference, so we gave them a name. These are different organizations, just means that people are coming from different organizations. We just anonymize them in this way, just for simplicity.
Thank you so much, Anna. I am going to take over now so that we can continue this conversation at the coffee break afterwards. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to present some findings today and some thoughts on the strategies that ERGs use to assess, or organizations are used to assess the needs of LGBTIQ plus individuals, and how actually the conversation that Anna has illustrated is often lacking can actually be facilitated in the organization. Now, right, I don't have to tell you really, but looking around the room, there's many diversity dimensions that I can see, like your skin color, for example, or the clothes that you wear, your gender expression, perhaps, but I cannot see your sexual orientation. And as Anna has also already identified, this can be a problem, right, for visibility and so on. So You might actually think that this is private information, and that's what I'm interested in whether you think that that is the case. But at least we know from research that identities such as sexual orientation, gender identity, really do matter at work. Since these relatively invisible groups such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender employees are structurally disadvantaged at work, they feel less included in organizations, and as a result, they really suffer in terms of well-being and performance. So there's really a reason for these networks, the ERGs, to be implemented, right? And inclusion really is of crucial importance to both employees and organizations. And what is inclusion? So in our research, we identify it as the feeling of employees that they can be themselves at work and that they belong in the organization. And this sense of inclusion, I've tried to make this a bit visual for you to make it easier, is facilitated for both majority and minority group members in a climate where divergent opinions and diversity is really appreciated, where divergent views are respected, where everyone can be themselves. So a climate for inclusion. And so what you really want to know is how that climate can be achieved, right? Now, the tools that organizations have at their disposal for doing so are the diversity programs, the initiatives, including networks that they have at their disposal. And in these programs, they may take different approaches. So most commonly, we actually see that an identity-blind approach is taken, where from an equality point of view, so from a benevolent point of view, differences between groups are ignored, right? We shouldn't place too much emphasis on group identities, is the idea. Alternatively, organizations can take an identity-conscious approach, as we call it, which really acknowledges group differences and even celebrates them. Now, we see that organizations and majority group members actually tend to prefer this identity-blind approach, because it really fits with this idea, right, that inclusion is about everyone, and so nobody is different, we are all equal. But there are actually some indications that identity-conscious policy is more effective in creating an inclusive climate for all, and that LGBTIQ+ employees prefer such an approach. And this is the project of Kshitij Moore, who you will be seeing later on as well, to look at this. But we really do not know very much about this. We also do not know very much about the considerations that go into the diversity program. So what are the ideas behind these approaches thought up by HR employees, D&I professionals, and management? Whereas these people who create these programs have their own biases, their own assumptions. Now, and that's what I look at in my work, so I really try to tease out how from the bottom up, so to say, what employees think about the diversity and inclusion programs that organizations implement and develop. And on the other hand, the people who develop these programs, how they look at these things and what barriers are there in making sure that these two layers come together. And so to bridge to what I actually want to show you, to develop and implement these D&I policies towards creating inclusive workplaces, organizations really need to know what our employees' needs, right? I think that's where it starts. You need to know what is needed in the workplace to create the sense of inclusion, and there are different ways to do that, but we don't actually know very much about what ways there are. And that was the focus of this interdisciplinary research project that I'm telling you about today, which was funded by the very nicely titled Center for Unusual Collaborations, in which I worked with people from very diverse disciplines, including immunology, engineering, cultural history, English literature, on this issue of how unheard and unseen individuals are could become better represented in different contexts, in the context, in our case, of the hospital, of the workplace, which is what I'll tell you about today, and the neighborhood. In the workplace project, we used semi-structured interviews and focused on HR and leadership at first. In the next phase, we're actually focusing on employees, and assessed the views of these interviewees on how these needs of LGBTIQ+ people can be assessed. So we asked them, how do you identify the needs? What channels do you use? What initiatives do you organize? To get a sense of whether these channels actually reach all people in their various intersections. Because we also noticed, like Anna was saying, that networks are less diverse than you might expect based on the acronym of LGBTIQ+. Now, to facilitate interdisciplinary communication, which really isn't so easy when you work with immunologists and historians, we work with visual moderators. And this is just to show you what the sort of conclusion is of the research, but then in an image. And so I'll take you through this. Because what we found is actually that our respondents, so in this phase of the project, these were the people on the left, the HR professionals and the ERG representatives, are really well intended, right, to assess and address the needs of LGBTIQ+ employees. So we didn't encounter anyone who said, oh yeah, we don't need to know, right? They want to know, they just don't really know how to do it and have all these ideas about ways that you could do it. So, because what we noted is that their strategies for actually assessing these needs are rather passive, and also they do not really consider the diversity within the group. So, for example, the ERG had a really important function as a channel through which to reach individuals, but the HR professionals had a lot of trust that that would be enough, that as long as they worked with the ERG, that then they would know all the different needs that were there in the workplace. And they didn't consider that maybe the ERG is a great way to do that, but is not sufficient. Because these networks were rather homogeneous, we also saw that most organizations do use employee satisfaction surveys, but then do not ask about people's sexual orientation or gender identity, and certainly are not able to cross this with other identity characteristics like ethnicity, for example. And not just because of low numbers, also because of how the surveys are structured. And from these interviews, we identified multiple barriers that impede the efforts of professionals to assess and address the needs of LGBTIQ+ employees. And these can be practical, sociocultural, and sort of assumption-driven barriers. So practical barriers are maybe lack of time, lack of resources, which we really saw is an issue in organizations, too few people to really put effort into this, or limited managerial support, right? The support from the top may be low. Social cultural barriers could be a heteronormative work climate, people not really understanding why it's necessary to have these networks, or even the normalization of discriminative remarks. And then assumption-driven barriers are misconceptions and biases that people hold. So when asked, for example, why not all LGBTIQ+ individuals may be reached in the organization, the HR and network representatives said, well, you know, maybe because some people are just happy. They're out and happy and they do not need a network, right? So that's why they're not members and that's why we do not necessarily reach them. And there may be a second group of people who are in the closet. And so they may have needs, they may have grievances, but they're not going to be members because they do not want to out themselves. But they didn't consider the possibility that there would be a third group of people who did have grievances, but did not see the network as representing them, or not the right channel for them to let their needs be known, right? And I think, I'm a big fan of ERGs, by the way, I should maybe also say that, but I think this is really important to consider, right? Are we doing the things that work for all LGBTIQ+ individuals in the organization? And it seems to be somewhat of a gap. Now, with regard to the employee satisfaction survey, we really noted that the issue of privacy was a very important barrier, data privacy issues, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because these are sensitive categories and we need to be very careful that the information isn't used in the wrong way or gets to the wrong people, and so we need to protect that. But oftentimes the HR professionals actually didn't really know what they were allowed to ask, and they assumed that nothing was allowed and they didn't really further investigate, whereas the GDPR has much more room for it if you do it in the right way. So we found that there was also a lack of knowledge there that may be a barrier, and I'm not arguing that we should be asking everything, we should do it in a really careful way, but it is of course one way that you can assess needs of individuals in the organization. So yeah, so it's really an empirical question, right? I think that what do employees think about these things? Would they be okay with their data being collected in the organization? And we saw that actually HR did not often ask. They just assumed, oh, it's too private, it's too personal, people are not going to want to share this information, but they never actually opened up a dialogue about it. And that's where my research then fills the gap, hopefully, at least as a start, to see, well, what do employees actually think about this? Are they willing to share their data on an anonymous survey in the organization if it's for inclusion purposes? So if it's to chart the average level of felt inclusion in different groups in the organization, or even perhaps to register the information in their personnel file, right? What do they think about it? And so we conducted 2 survey studies, one on a representative sample of the Dutch working population, which had smaller percentage of LGBTIQ plus people in it than cis-hetero people, and also an additional sample of Dutch LGBTIQ plus participants, which was not representative, because that's a big issue with this type of research. And then we asked them how private and sensitive they find a range of employee characteristics, how willing they are to share such information in anonymous workplace surveys and to register it in their personnel file. We also asked them whether they think other, in parentheses, depending on who they are themselves, LGBTI plus employees would be willing to share, so what their thoughts are about LGBTI people, and whether they trust their employer with this information. And this looks more complicated than it is. I'll walk you through it. The gray bars are the cis-hetero participants, the pink bars the LGBTIQ plus participants. And what we see here is that gender identity and sexual orientation are perceived as more private and more sensitive compared to gender for both cis-hetero and LGBTIQ plus participants. And I know also actually more sensitive than other identity characteristics from other research I've done. Cis-hetero participants trust their employer a little bit more with their data, but both groups on average score above the neutral point on this scale, so they tend to have more than neutral trust in their employer with such data. LGBTIQ plus participants' willingness to share and register is actually higher than cis-hetero participants perceived their willingness to be, which I think is an interesting result. I do have to note that these groups are not equivalent. The age was younger in the LGBTIQ plus group. There were some other differences. It was mainly the gender distribution was also different. But I think this is something at least to get us thinking about, well, maybe we should ask people in our organization how they feel about this. And we see that the LGBTIQ plus participants' willingness to share is higher than cis-hetero participants' willingness to share, and also their willingness, whereas their willingness to register the information in their personnel file is equal. Now, we also did some analysis to show that these things all relate to each other, so when you perceive it as more private, this information, you're going to be less willing to share. If you have more trust in your employer, you're going to be more willing to share, etc. But what I'm trying to give you as a takeaway is that I think, well, first of all, that there's important barriers to assessing the needs of LGBTIQ plus employees, and thus barriers to furthering inclusion at work. These are, there are different types. They're practical, social-cultural, and assumption-driven barriers. And organizations really need to find ways to assess these needs better and check their assumptions about privacy perceptions, sensitivity, misconceptions of the GDPR. And in order to create an inclusive climate. So instead of assuming that people are not going to want to share their data, they really need to involve their employees in this decision, I think, to know what works in their own organization, rather than just copying it, perhaps, from other organizations, which may be very different. The climate may be really different. And I think the ERG is the discussion partner for this at first, right? I really think that these discussions need to take place with, between management and the ERG, but also beyond that to consider the strategies. So dialogue is really crucial. Just to give you a sense of ways that I try to bring our research to organizations in a more concrete and practical way, this is a guide that we developed with the law faculty at Utrecht University about the GDPR and what it actually says about collecting data on sexual orientation and gender identity. This was developed in collaboration with Workplace Pride, and it can be found on our website, which I will share with you after the conference. And also we have a poster campaign now to help HR start dialogue with employees about these topics, not just sexual orientation, but also burnout and menopause. To talk about, well, what does this mean for you? Are these issues that need to be addressed? And to also then have an opportunity to ask employees about how the organization should proceed. It's done in a bit of a whimsical way. The idea is that HR posts this around the intranet and the organization and follows up with an email saying like, hey, you know, would you like to have a dialogue session with us? We're also looking for organizations that want to implement this together with us so that we can then research what this brings to organizations and help you make sure that it actually delivers what we hope it will. And that's it from me. I hope I made up some time.
I think
one question.
Yeah, I think we have time for one question. In the meantime, maybe the panelists can already start taking their seats. Is there anyone who has a question? No, it seems not.
Then we talk over coffee afterwards. It's also so hot here, don't you feel? It's nice to have good weather. We will appreciate it over coffee. I think we're going outside for it. Anna, do you want to join us? Yeah. And I give the floor to Kshitij Moore, who is the moderator of this session and a PhD student at Utrecht University working on LGBTIQ plus inclusion. Here, go ahead.
Right, I hope everyone can hear me. Hello, everyone. I'm Kshitij Moore. As Jan introduced, I'm a PhD student in my first year at Utrecht University, and she's my direct supervisor. And for this panel session, we have, of course, Anna Inasdotter, you heard her talk. Then we have David Pollard from Workplace Pride. We have Lynn ten Haaf from Unilever and Eric Poelman from PwC. So for the first question, we just had two lovely talks about research, and I was wondering if there were any insights from the talk that resonated with you, any challenges that you've seen or maybe have already resolved in your organization. If we could start with you, Eric.
Yes, of course, thank you. Yeah, of course, the belonging is always a question we also have as an as a party. Do we have all the people involved in our network? So that's indeed a very important question, and we try to we have our Satisfy survey where we ask the general sexuality. So then we can measure it every year, and if there are differences, but because and the most important thing, of course, is ask your members indeed. Do you feel belonging, and do you feel belonged? And we did that a few years ago, and then we find out that we were indeed too much of a male group, and the women didn't feel belonged. So we set up a women team, and now that's also changed. So this was my first thought.
Yeah, that's great. And then Lynn, have you, especially as an HR representative, and Janneke talked a little bit about that, have you had experiences with any of these challenges, or have you already ever overcome them, or at least are in the process of it?
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely in the process, and I learned a lot during the talks today. A challenge I am overcoming myself right now is to try to get ED&I data into our personnel files indeed, and Unilever is, in that sense, I think tries to be a very inclusive workplace, but is also a very cautious legal workplace. So I will definitely use your studies to also show our legal colleagues, because indeed I have been talking with our ERG obviously about this, and they are super open and willing, and obviously asking us to start this. So yeah, I was intrigued a lot by the talks today. Another one on your one, Anna, is indeed sometimes I join these conversations, sometimes I also don't, and now I'm starting to wonder, are the conversations different when I, as HR professional, join them? Probably they are. And then being more conscious of when I will join and when I will not join. So that not only during the informal conversations, the most important conversations can take place.
Yeah, I imagine that's makes quite a difference, especially if you join as an HR manager in these conversations. There's probably a different format altogether, especially if you announce it in advance. Yeah. And David, do you have any things to add?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, first of all, for both of you for the really excellent presentations. But one thing I have to say that I was a little bit missing was that when you're starting up an ERG, one question is it really more from the grassroots or from the organization itself? And I think that's an important nuance to bring into the conversation as well, because it has a totally different dynamic as to how it gets started and how it continues. And another aspect is actually what type of organization we're talking about. Different business models have sometimes vastly different ways of looking at any type of ERG. You know, if an ERG is in one country, for example, but you want to have some type of effort in different places around the world, it depends a lot on the hierarchy of the organization. If it's a very top-down organization, they could say, yes, we will have an ERG available or some type of facility in different places around the world. But if it's very flat organizations, as a lot of the consultancies are, you know, it's very country-driven or regional-driven. And that means that ERGs have an extra barrier to get through, and HR professionals for that matter as well, because sometimes the organizational structure simply doesn't allow you to. So that was kind of the thing that I'm curious about more than anything else. You looked at it very much from how an organization gets started and how, you know, the diversity within ERGs themselves, but I would like to see also from an organizational standpoint so that we can say to organizations, you need to do this as much as possible. I mean, you've said that to a large degree, but it's a fascinating topic. Yeah.
I think you bring up a good point, especially about the fact that ERGs in different countries from these large organizations. Eric, I've heard you have experience with having these like ERGs across multiple in different countries with different kinds of laws and different kinds of opinions about homosexuality. How does, do you have any comments about that?
Yes, for us indeed, it's the TRPs are country-wise, but since 2 years we have more communications with the EMEA countries, and we set up a Shine Summit every June in the Pride Month, and last month of last year we also set up a Shine network in Poland. So that what became because of working together. So that's starting points to help other countries to.
Can you, for everyone, because I also am not entirely sure, explain what exactly is the Shine network?
Shine is the LGBT.
For the PwC. Right.
Yeah, for PwC. That's globally, it's called Shine indeed. Yeah, so it's in 30 countries, and we are country-wise, but we try to make the connection more between the countries.
Yeah. I think another important point that was brought up by David was also how in ERG, when you start an ERG, you also want to make an impact in the organization, ideally also perhaps at society at large. How do you do that? Like if the ERG starts from bottom up, top down, how does it change the culture at an organization?
Is that for me?
Yes, David.
Okay, good. Actually, okay, this is where you have to stop me if I'm talking too much. I started together with a number of other employees, the LGBT employee network at ING, and there's somebody else in the room here, Martha, who was also there at the very beginning. That was very much a grassroots effort, and it was a challenge, but we had the passion to get it going back then, and that's what drove us to continue the ERG, and we were able to actually convince the organization that it was also in their interest. So that is something that I think that organizations, and actually the LGBTIQ plus community ourselves, really need to recognize that we bring passion to the table, and passion can be good for organizations. When you can have people like this who are willing and able to commit their time, usually volunteer time, to a company or to an organization, that's something that needs to be really embraced and actually empowered as well. And so I think, from an advice standpoint, what I would say to organizations is, and this is what I saw also in the research, you do sometimes have to make the case, why do we need to exist as an ERG? But my call or my request would be for organizations to understand how powerful it is to actually have this voice. And yes, there are plenty of issues, you know, they're not as diverse as we would like for them to be, but it's partly because the RGs don't feel as empowered to do as much as they should. So I'm really wandering here all over the place, but I think it's so important to continue to have ERGs. It's the lifeblood of the LGBTIQ plus movement in the workplace, because we as people from the community, we cannot expect organizations to carry our flag for us. We have to do it ourselves. We do it together with other ERGs, together with organizations, with HR, and always with the leadership of an organization to keep it going.
So then involving the leadership is the quite central aspect.
Absolutely key to involve leadership. Without that authentic leadership of an organization, really you can't do any type of, not just LGBTIQ+, but any type of D&I activity. You've got to have that top leadership involved.
And just as a follow-up, how do you get the leadership to care about these issues? How do you get the leadership? Of course, you can start from the grassroots, but at some point you have to.
I'm going to go out on a limb here. Those organizations who really authentically want to create a diverse workplace, they get it already. They know it's in their strategic interest, from creating a workplace where you can recruit people, all types of people, and retain people. If they don't get LGBT, in my opinion, or ethnic diversity or gender diversity, then there's something wrong with them as a leader, basically.
That's, yeah, very solid point. Anna, do you have something to say about that from your experience with the NHS?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of points that you've raised already about belonging and... Sorry, I'm on now, haven't I? Yeah, so it's lots of points you've raised so far about belonging and how do we actually make people feel welcome in an environment. It's tricky. And I would say that meetings are definitely not the answer to make people feel welcome. They're very procedural and very formal, and they put people off quite a lot. There was another point raised about involvement of HR, and it is really important. It really is important to involve HR or EDI representative in an organization, but only when you need them. Not every meeting, not every activity that you do, but on your, actually, when you need them, then you need to kind of push forward with it. But having HR or EDI present all the time isn't necessarily all that helpful. It can have a silencing effect, but it's really, really important to be there to support as and when needed. And there was something that you mentioned also about the grassroots and versus organizational driven. And we did try to tease out with the network, so were they actually driven by the people themselves from the group or put on by the organization? In a lot of cases, it was very difficult to ascertain which case it was, because the networks have been in operation for a number of years. People just couldn't remember, and those who started it had left the organization, so it was really difficult to really know, is this a grassroots movement or not? But for those that we knew that had a very strong organizational kind of a drive to it, they did struggle. The passion just wasn't the same. And when it was not coming from the people that it was meant to serve, it was really difficult to keep the momentum. And there was a lot of, when that was set up, there's a lot of bang, there's a lot of activities, and it's all jolly and happy, and there's lots of activities. It's difficult to maintain that. So actually longevity is a big challenge for networks, and to keep the momentum going for long. And the final point I sort of want to raise about the difficulty people are, you want to raise awareness of maybe some difficult issues as an activist, but you're also employed by the organization, and it's really a balancing act. So this is why a lot of the campaigning efforts within an organizational setting they are very constrained, because ultimately we are employed by the organization themselves. So it's really, people go for safe methods that are non-challenging, non-threatening in any way. So that really plays a significant role. So it's always difficult to work within the context of work, because you might lose your job if you say the wrong thing.
I think that's a very important point you bring up about activism within the organization, and if how much the organization supports it. And I guess my question would then be, how do you make it that through these ERGs or through these initiatives, the organization also then works or does something to make a difference, so the activism is not individual, just the ERG doing it, but the organization at large? Lynn, do you have a...
Yeah, and I mean, also touching to a point made earlier on leadership involvement, here I also think that, you know, whenever our ERG, and if it's the LGBTIQ plus ERG or another, that leadership also shows that they're there is a very important, well, and quick win, to be honest. However, I have to also be honest that many of our leaders are, I think, great leaders, authentic leaders, and very big sponsors. But there are also still types who are keeping asking on, I don't know, business cases around ED&I, which I always say it's ridiculous because I've never seen a business case on having a homogeneous group of male running a business. So why do I have to show that it's better to do it by a diverse group? But what really helped for our local leadership team is sharing true stories from people in Unilever, and it was a big ask to our ERG, but many stepped up and wanted to share their own situations, because it's still horrible that these situations still take place even in our workforce, but they do. And then have that conversation, and I spoke to some leaders who are more of the traditional kind, who really said that that was a game changer for them to understand how it feels that every time in a new team you again have to share your sexuality, because it's still considered as something else than normal, what they refer to. So that was really a very game-changing thing for us to have those type of conversations, one-on-one with leaders and people who experienced any type of not belonging in our workplace.
I think that's, I guess what it boils down to from all these talks often is about having a conversation with the people in your organization and seeing what their needs are. And I know, Eric, you said that, that PwC assesses needs quite often, has these conversations. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes, also right after Black Lives Matter, of course, we had dialogue sessions within the firm and raising diverse questions, and people tell their stories to the others, and then indeed the white male in our organization, oh, well, I never thought about this. You have to come out every day. That was not in my mind, so that helped indeed. And we had questions with our network, and they say, well, our employee benefits are not diverse enough. We, as rainbow families, we have not equal rights. So we addressed it to the leadership, and they said, we didn't know. Are we not equal? Just change it. So that was last year. That was the most simple thing we changed in our employee benefits, that the rainbow families are equal now. And, well, you were first, but finally last year we had the transition leave as well. And after that, we sent out a leadership message with this change in our employee benefits. And 1 hour later, I had a colleague on the phone saying, wow, this couldn't be better at the time than right now. And 1 month ago, he showed to the whole organization telling his story about his transition. So then, for me, that really helps, and that's why we are existing.
I think that's also, like we've talked a lot about ERGs, but these other practices of having transition leave have been inclusive of rainbow families. I was wondering, as, I guess, a researcher in my first year, like what other types of these best practices are there that are employed in your organization that you think of or that you think should be employed perhaps in organizations? Maybe we can start with David.
I was just thinking here, the type of dynamic that's going on between leadership and ERGs. What's something we've used even when I was working at ING a long time ago, and I've heard of from many other organizations, is reverse mentoring. And this is really how somebody from the LGBTI community can speak directly with a board member of an organization to help them understand, what the priorities actually are. And often, I think your research kind of underlines this as well, that often leaders are a little bit scared of making a mistake. They don't want to embarrass anybody. They want to do the right thing. There's a willingness there. And so if they can be together with representatives of the LGBTI community and hear from them directly through storytelling, the personal things that really matter. That can begin to change the dialogue in a long-term basis so that the leadership truly understands, how important this is for an organization, and they can build it into their strategic outlook so that they don't have to revisit it, or every time a leader changes that they have to start all over again, or that when somebody from the ERG leaves, they have to start all over again. No, it really needs to be part of the medium to long-term view of an organization, and that will slowly begin to make change. And I was going to just say one other comment to what Eric was saying about the value of ERGs, and that's often sometimes on a very personal level. I've heard it from so many times, that particularly from trans colleagues, once there's a policy in place that really addresses, which for the organization might be a tiny thing, for them it's a life-changing event. And this is so important, for employers to realize that we spend, a third of our lives at work, and if people from the community can truly be themselves, that is the business case. Because at that point, they're really engaged, they're loyal, and they're a good ambassador to everybody else as well.
I think that's a very good point. Also, if you, for the business case and for these things of how important being yourself at work is, how important it is to not have to fear being, experiencing prejudice at work, all the benefits of that are also in research. If you ask researchers, their papers, there's so many surveys and so much done about it. And sustainable cooperation, which is was announced at the beginning, that's what it means of having these measures in place that will stay over time, that won't disappear after a change in management or so on. But slightly pivoting from that, because we've been talking a lot about LGBTQI ERGs, and of course there's different minority groups in an organization, and they all have different needs that at some point may be competing. And how do you sort of reconcile these needs? I think you've had experience with that.
Yes, we had. So in our LGBTIQ plus ERG, the idea came up to introduce gender-neutral toilets, and also in a conversation with Workplace Pride, we learned that actually best practice is to only have gender-neutral toilets, because at home we also don't have gender-specific toilets. However, our ethnic diverse resource group were a bit struck by that, for example, for girls who wear hijab and want to have a place where they can safely remove their scarf and put everything right together. So having that conversation and understanding why they feel a need for a private place for her to go in as a girl, and the LGBTIQ plus community having a place where it's normal, actually the standard in our workplace, that there's no necessarily a gender identity as male and female for everyone. That conversation sparked a lot between those groups, and I'm still working on it, but the plan will be to have the main toiletries gender neutral, but indeed where our fire escape is, which is still on every floor, there's also an option to go for a male and female toilet. But that conversation was a game changer, I think, for both ERGs.
Yeah, thank you for that, because it's a really great way of reconciling these needs. Eric, have you had experience with that with these different groups and different identities coming together in an organization?
Yeah, well, I think when we started in 2007, we all had diversity groups, and now we say we are inclusion groups. And we work much more together with the other networks. So we have combined session with the Connected Cultures Network, and talking about intersectionality, because that's across every ERG. So we say be involved with each other instead of being separate. So I think that's a big change we started a few years ago. And then you have the discussions like, indeed, as we want to have a gender-neutral toilet, but what's the need of the others? And for ability, etc. So then, be more connected with each other. Then you get the right discussions indeed.
And then when you changed from these diversity to inclusive networks, was it just a change in the way, what kind of changes were you involved when you became?
No, in the beginning it was just the networks did their events and their discussions and their surveys. They all had separate surveys, and now we started to to do the same survey from the networks to all the participants. So it's one survey instead of different. But of course, you make the section from which ERG are you, so we can see if there are differences. So it's more working together, invite the others to the other network instead of being separate.
I think that's a great practice of involving all these different employees. And yeah, so again, talking to the employees and assessing their needs, but also sort of facilitating a conversation between the employees so they can see where their needs maybe match or don't match. I guess now, this is something for us researchers that we would really like to hear is what kind of initiatives or issues do you think maybe there isn't enough information on for you, something that maybe we can help with and we can research. You already mentioned something about, of course, there shouldn't be a business case, but if the people higher up need a business case, then there is something in the literature. But what other issues do you think us as researchers could help practitioners with? Maybe you can start with David.
I was afraid you might do that. I think one thing, which is kind of like the business case, is really understanding the true value that an ERG gives to an organization. And this is what's been touched upon quite a bit here. But I remember, when I started the ERG, again, together with other employees back at ING, it was a battle to try to find time. And it was only after I left, as I understood, that ING put into place a framework to actually recognize the work that was being done by the ERG employees. It was built into the HR system. I think it would be great if more research could be done to really fortify that concept, that yes, if you're involved, it not only contributes to the bottom line of the organization, but it also contributes to the personal development of each individual. And that's ultimately what an organization wants as well, because intrinsically that's also going to help the business and it helps the individual. So it might be a bit of a socioeconomic direction for the research, but I'd like to see more about that, actually. And then also, if I can throw it in, about the international element, the cross-border element of ERGs and D&I, LGBTI, D&I in general. There's just so much to be done still there.
Lynn, do you have any comments on that?
It's difficult to, I don't know, but my feel, in my world of HR, there's a whole thing of networked organizations and self-organizing teams. And I think there would be something interesting in, at least how I see it, our ERGs are our best examples of self-organizing teams. I don't know how, but maybe there's something there.
Right. And Eric, do you have any further comments on that?
Yeah, well, for us, always is the important, are we serving the right people indeed, or do they belong, and how to reach the people who are in the closets. That's still, for me, an important, how do we reach them, because we can't ask it, but how do you reach them? I think that's an important, that's still a struggle we all have, I think.
Yeah, no, as Janneke highlighted, it's quite an issue reaching everyone, all these small groups, especially with people with intersectional identities and people who are in the closet. But I think we're almost coming to close time. Are there any final comments from the panel?
I was also actually curious, Anna, maybe you can say a little bit about the international angle, because you've now focused on the NHS, right? But we're also collaborating in an international network that is funded by EU, the COST network on LGBTIQ plus inequalities. What have you seen there so far on differences internationally and how that might relate to what we talk about today?
Yeah, so we are a part of a large European network that involves scholars and practitioners and to lesser extent workplaces, organizations. So we have kind of 3 key areas that we're focusing on where we feel that LGBTQI plus people are experiencing difficulties. That is families and communities, that's one. One is about employment and well-being, and the third one is social and legal inclusion. I suppose we are still in the early stages, but it's very clear from the outset that we live in very different worlds from where you are located does have a huge impact on people's everyday life. And that is experienced on the ground, and the scholars that are involved in the network very much tell that story themselves, also working in an environment that is LGBT hostile, maybe. And that really shapes the type of work that they do, and the availability of actually being an academic, focusing on such a marginalized topic in the country where there's very little understanding of it in the first place. I mean, I know how difficult it can be in a context where it's fairly okay with it. I'm still a little bit of a strange fish in a management school. Nobody's doing anything like me there. People are focusing on leadership styles and all the different things, but I'm doing totally different things. But that's okay. I can still do that. And I realize that that's a huge privilege in comparison to a lot of the other scholars that are in the networks who are just struggling to just do what they would love to do and contribute and support the communities that they come from. So yeah, it's early days still, but I've got high hopes that, especially when now we're able to see each other face to face, and what a relief. I can't even tell you how different this feels. Thank you.
Right. Thank you
It's
so
time
much.
for final comments.
Yeah, I think it's now time for final comments. From anything that was said, anything about the presentations from either of you. And if not, then I guess we'll go on to, oh, Dave.
Allow them.
You have to be quick around here, don't you? Well, I just want to say I would like to thank both of you from a scientific scholarly standpoint to go down this route, because I mean many people in this room have been dealing with LGBTIQ plus employee networks for a very long time, and it's good to see a lot of serious scientific effort being put towards it, and then translating that into the practical world that we all live in as well. So kudos to both of you. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for everybody here coming today, because I know that you're going back to your own organization and you have to live it every day as well, don't you?
Right, I think that's the perfect place to close the panel session.
Yeah, very nice.
And then I'll hand the mic back to you, Jannica.
Thank you. I guess I get to have the final comment. I was also struck by what you said about the tension that you are both an employee and an activist, right, in the organization. And I think that that's also where Workplace Pride really has a role, to be that outside perspective for organizations. So I think, yeah, it's good to realize that. I want to thank you all for being here and enduring this really warm room. I want to thank Professor Innersdatter for joining us today and giving the keynote, and to the panel for sharing the best practices. We knew that our talks were going to be more critical of ERGs, and this is also why we wanted to showcase how you can improve ERGs, and we hope that that is what you take away from this session. There are problems, but they're surmountable, and we hope as academics to contribute to that. We have really silenced the online participants here because of time constraints. We didn't want to go over 1.5 hours, but we do assure you that we will look at all the questions and comments and try to incorporate that in our summary afterwards, so just be assured. For those present here, we are going to the garden, I think, I hope at least, to have coffee and tea and to have our chats. I want to thank Workplace Pride for their continued effort to the research in this field, and a special thanks to the PhD students who have helped organize this symposium. Shitic, Hao with the microphone, and Paula, who is hiding here with the laptop to keep an eye on the session. Do make sure to get to know them, because they really are the next generation. Their questions are going to be even better than mine and Anna's, because they live it and are part of this new wave, I think. So that's my introduction for you to meet them, and thank you for being here. We keep you updated on what we do. Thank you.